Hey, this is Warren Sprouse, and you're on the Bible Forum. It's Sunday night. It's October 16. That is a week after Hurricane Matthew. We weren't able to get together during Hurricane Matthew, and I missed the opportunities. I had a whole pile of things that I wanted to share with you, but it was not to be. Some of those things we'll get to tonight. Other things we'll have to just wait for the appropriate time. I'm struggling with my earpiece here. For some reason, it just keeps wanting to pull out of my ear, fall down over my back and carry on. I don't know what that's about. Anyway, as we begin this evening, we have a whole slew of things that we need to talk about. You need to know that here in South Carolina, in the Charleston area, we fared rather well, I think, in the wake of Hurricane Matthew. Our friends in North Carolina are still struggling. Their death toll is up over 45, I think it is. They're getting a lot of water coming down out of the mountains. Apparently a levee broke and some other things, but you know, having lived in Wilmington for 20 years, it becomes common knowledge and understanding that when we get a storm, about 2 days later, all that water runs down to the ocean. And there's a lot of streams and rivers and whatever, and in some cases it actually has taken out sections of Interstate 95. It's pretty vicious. Here in Charleston, we had I don't know how many, 6, 8 people that perished, some foolishly unwilling to leave clearly dangerous situations, but others just caught in one of those circumstances. So we appreciate it. We have friends in Florida, friends of the program in Florida who did well, checked in with them. Haven't heard from Georgia. But since there's not a whole lot of information coming to us about Georgia, I assume that they got away pretty good. I'm going to be taking a trip tomorrow, Monday, to Beaufort, South Carolina. It's kind of hard to say that coming from North Carolina because we have a Beaufort. They're spelled the same, but this is Beaufort. Dear friend of the ministry, Nash Green, passed away a week ago Tuesday. He had COPD and it finally got him. And I'm going to be doing a funeral down in Beaufort, South Carolina, right outside of Paris Island. If you're in the neighborhood, stop in and say hey. We're going to be at the VA cemetery there. It's a national cemetery at noon tomorrow. So you pray for that family as they work their way through this. Some of you have gotten shirts this week. If you want a shirt, it looks like this. If you'd like one, just holler at me. For $30 a month commitment, we'll send you a shirt. I'll send you a book. You see there's a couple of books sitting up here. I've written a couple and just ordered a whole slew of them for the holidays. I'm going to sign them. Some of you have already asked for them. We've sent those out, and I thought it'd be good to have an assortment on hand. But if you would be interested in that, just send me an email, give me a call, do something. We'll make sure that you get what you need. Christmas is coming, and you know, people like stuff like this, so see what you can do. You got the email this week, I trust. You got one last week just hollering at you about maybe not being on the air, and we weren't. The electric came back on here in Summerville, South Carolina at 1 minute to 10 Sunday evening, and I was tempted to just run into the studio and sit down and start broadcasting, but it was late, and I was set up. I was ready to go, but it was not to be. This is the email that got sent out this week. Some pretty little pictures on the bottom end of it, telling you some of the things that are going on here and going to be happening. Tonight we're going to talk about the election, about Trump and that sort of stuff. Glenn Beck's in the news. Bob Dylan, Nobel laureate. Who'd have thunk it? We're going to talk about that a little bit. The testimony of Western civilization. That's a big topic. We'll discuss some of that. Later on, we'll talk about how the church is shooting itself in the foot, and I think that's going to be an ongoing sequence of thought. It seems like every time I turn around, there's another article, something else pops up. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll get into Augustine as well. You don't know anything about Augustine, do you? Augustine of Hippo. No, he's not riding around on hippopotami. Augustine of Hippo. Hippo was in North Africa, and he's an old church father back in the 400-500s A.D. A man who probably almost single-handedly set the church doctrinally on target and moved them forward. But we'll get to that as the night unfolds. I read a Christianity Today article. It was a scathing article by a Christian author whose name is Andy Crouch. This is not Andre. This is a Christian author whose name is Andy Crouch. And he makes it clear that evangelicals, of all people, just should not be silent when it comes to Donald Trump's blatant immorality. Now, maybe this is true, maybe it's not. And I do think that Christians ought to speak up. I wrote an article this week, a newsletter to pastors. If you don't have your pastor on my list, shame on you. You need to send that to me. But I wrote a newsletter just for them. The publication is called Rod and Staff, talking about some of these things. Maybe one day I'll share some of that with you. But this fellow is calling Trump out. He's some kind of a terrible guy who says all these evil things about women. Christian author and professor Denny Burk applauds Crouch's article. He says in his blog post that Burke is calling on Christians to stand up for biblical morality, which in this case means not supporting the Donald. Christians ought not to vote for Donald Trump. He reminds us that unfortunately the media and secular culture are likely to not distinguish between evangelicals who support Trump and those who do not. And so Christians need to be united in a vocal, almost said a vocal voice. That's a little redundant, isn't it? In their vocal expression and condemnation of a candidate who, according to this article, is the perfect embodiment of the earthly nature that the Bible talks about. Now, there's a number of things here I think need to be said, not in defense of Trump, but just for clarification and your edification. When you are reading articles and they are in avowed evangelical Christian publications, or you are reading about someone who is characterizing themselves or is characterized as an evangelical Christian, you have to think worldly. You have to think more worldly than godly, or at least biblically. Because today, evangelical Christianity means just that. And here we have Christianity Today, a publication that began back in the 1950s, Billy Graham. But in the last 30 years or more, it has been firmly in the grasp of worldly thinking and pseudo-Christian philosophy. It will, in the recent publication I was reading, was referring to the Christian Liberal Arts College in Los Angeles by the name of Biola. We've talked about this before. Biola is the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, and it did start out strong. But it has not been a Bible Institute for decades. It still calls itself that, but it fails to live up to that word. And across the board in evangelicalism, the labels no longer define or describe the people or the institutions who are speaking or being represented. In my newsletter to pastors, I compared the mood of the 1960s and 70s, which was Donald's formative adult years, with a TV program that was popular in the late 1960s and early 1970s. You might have remembered it, or you might remember it. It's called Laugh-In. Miniskirts, go-go girls, lewd jokes, and everybody laughing. It was funny. The left was pushing this thing and was all over it, in favor of it, and now all of a sudden, not so much. Who changed? Now, I'm not defending Donald. Donald's got his own problems. But there was a time when what Donald is being accused of, and there's some evidence that it's not all of it is what it seems, but what he's being accused of sounds rational. It sounds like something he would do. He's of that generation. He's been married 3 times. He has courted and wed glamorous women. He's got children by all of them. He's out there. His mouth is not sanctified. He's got a lot of money. He's able to go places and do things and say stuff, and he's been doing it. Remember a while back when the Donald said he was going to build a wall on the southern border of these United States? The left went crazy. They said that's just not 21st century thinking. Well, don't look now, but there are currently 63 borders in the world that have walls or fences, and more barriers are being built every day. More are being built today than at any other time in modern history, whatever that might mean. Can you say ISIS? France is in the process, has been for months if not years, and they plan to move tens of thousands of largely Muslim immigrants out of this camp that they've been in for the last several years, and they want to do that before winter. They are getting such grief, but they claim the suffering that goes on in that camp during winter is just off the chart, and they can't in good conscience allow it to continue. And they're going to build a wall to keep these people from getting into their country. Now, when you talk about this in these circles, they call it xenophobia, the fear of all things strange or different. When liberal France is talking about doing it, that term doesn't come up, does it? Only if you or I were talking about it, if Donald talks about it, that's what we get. You see, we are in a very unique place in global history. After a generation of what is called globalism, the West is wising up, and they're retrenching. They're starting to see you cannot have this wide range and flow of people groups around the country, around the world, and in and out of your country. It is chaos. What is true is that advanced nations are magnets for the world's poor, for the world's displaced. And nations are likely to continue to face this kind of movement and the moral issues that grow out of it. And the consequences are far-reaching in terms of humanity and in terms of these nation states. It remains to be seen if democratic nations, many of which have lucrative welfare infrastructures that guarantee food, education, health care, and the like, whether they can absorb the huddled masses of the world yearning to breathe free, especially when there's a fear that some among the huddled masses wish to destroy said nation state. How is it so many Western nations have switched to a progressive welfare state mentality? And why, having done so, do they have these masses flooding in to take advantage of it? And why didn't they anticipate that? And what are they going to do about it? It's an interesting set of questions. It isn't just one nation or two, it's the entire Western civilization that has suddenly over the last 100 years, switched to this progressive welfare mentality. Why is that? Well, Bible might have something to do with it. We'll talk about that one day. In other news, Bob Dylan was awarded a Nobel Prize for Literature this week. Another great Christian artist commented on Dylan's song entitled Every Grain of Sand, saying, quote, "It's like one of the great Psalms of David, the spellbinding ballad from, I assume it was the album Shot of Love, that concludes Dylan's overtly Christian songwriting phase. Equal parts of Blakean mysticism and biblical resonance, the song abandons the self-righteousness that plagued Dylan's religious work to offer a desperate prayer for salvation." Not my words. As Bono put it, quote, "Dylan stops wailing against the world, turns on himself, and is brought to his knees," end of quote. Dylan later described Every Grain of Sand as an inspired song that just came to me. I felt like I was just putting words down that were coming from somewhere else. They call that automatic writing. And in some circles it is encouraged, and it is pure occultism. But it is not unusual for some of these songwriters, especially during the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, some of these young people that, were putting this stuff out, to say things like this. You remember the Doors? They did a whole song that not one of those guys in the band had ever heard before. They never talked about it. They never rehearsed it. It just came out, and they did it on the stage, improvisation. And they talked about how it just came to them, and it was scary. There's another gal who's written a lot of beautiful songs. I can't remember her name, but she wrote about her son when he was just a child laying in a crib, and she wrote this whole song, and she said it just came. It was like somebody was talking to her. How about that? Robert Allen Zimmerman, born May 24th, 1941 in Hibbing, Minnesota, changed his name to Bob Dylan. As a child, he learned how to play guitar and harmonica, formed a rock and roll band called the Golden Chords when he was in high school. At college, he began performing folk songs at coffee houses under the name Bob Dylan, taking his last name from poet Dylan Thomas. Over the course of 1962, Dylan began to write a large batch of original songs, many of which were political protest songs in the vein of his Greenwich Village contemporaries. For my part, I grew up in the 1950s. I graduated high school in 1961. I was not a fan of Bob Dylan. I didn't know anybody in my group that was. His voice was gravelly, his style was sloppy and whiny. His lyrics were largely unintelligible, and what you could comprehend were, whiny. He always impressed me as a man who lived in his own world and emerged every once in a while to share his thoughts and values with people who were gullible and laden with their own angst. And he didn't seem to care whether you liked it or not. What he did somehow made sense to a large number of 60s druggies and radicals. But mainstream America was not all that impressed. Now, he gets the Nobel Peace Prize. Having done what? Nothing. He sang songs. He wrote lyrics. They were anti-war lyrics. They were pro-drug lyrics. They had some spirituality in it during that so-called Christian phase he went through. But all he did was write and sing songs. Welcome to the 21st century. This is what passes for art and for peace prizes.